Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrea Whistler, and I'm director here of the program on justice and peace at Georgetown. We are very honored today to have Professor Eli McCarthy here to talk about his new book, Becoming Nonviolent Peacemakers, A Virtue Ethic for Catholic Social Teaching and U.S. Policy. I'm very thankful to the Berkley Center for hosting and sponsoring this event, for providing the support and lunch, and I would especially like to thank Erin Coleman for all of her support and for making this event possible today. So Professor McCarthy is an adjunct professor of Justice and Peace Studies here at Georgetown. He has been teaching for our program for over 3 years, specifically sections on the Introduction to Justice and Peace course and the course on nonviolence. Besides teaching for us, he mentors students, is advising a senior on her senior thesis, and he has been the force behind the program's trainings in nonviolent conflict intervention, which we hold on Columbus Day and Martin Luther King Day each year. Professor McCarthy is also currently a Doyle Fellow at the university, and he has helped our students get involved with the Peace Alliance and the DC Peace Team. And this is only his part-time job. Professor McCarthy is currently Director of Justice and Peace for the Conference of the Major Superiors of Men. In this work, he is a regular participant in federal policy coalitions. Beyond this book, Professor McCarthy has also published in Peace Movements Worldwide, the Peace Studies Journal, and the Journal of Political Theology. He completed his PhD at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, where he focused his study and research on Catholic ethics and peace studies. So Professor McCarthy's book questions whether there's a more adequate way to assess nonviolent peacemaking beyond the two major forms of assessment most common in our society today: rule-based assessment and strategy-based assessment. He offers a painstakingly detailed review of the limits of both of these assessments, the rule-based and the strategy-based, relying on the works of philosophers and peace studies scholars. His analysis leads him to offer a virtues-based assessment of nonviolent peacemaking, enhanced by aspects of human rights paradigm for public discourse and policy. He is building on recent and necessary attention to the person and development of virtues and the relationship between virtue and human rights, specifically through the Bible as a medium for exploration. He helps us understand, he has helped me understand the importance of imagination, appreciation for the pervasiveness of conflict and its constructive components, and ideas of alternative kinds of power. Overall, I find the book to offer nonviolence for immediate problem of one's life, as well as for life's overarching questions as seen as in public policy and through communal interdependencies, both domestic and abroad. So, Professor McCarthy's book is timely given the moment in our society, as presidential candidates distance themselves from utilizing the word peace, let alone a framework of nonviolence or virtue. Further, for any students in this audience, I must advise you that Professor McCarthy's book is a great model of compelling social justice-based scholarship. It is incredibly well organized and structured, and I love that he does exactly what he sets out to do in the book. For students out there, I offer this book as a model for you. So Professor McCarthy is going to talk for approximately 35 minutes, and then we will follow with dialogue, questions, responses. We also have books for sale here, and so we're hoping that you'll be able to sign some copies for us. And Professor McCarthy has also said that he can get us the enjoyable discounted rate of the book at another time if we need to do so. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Andrea. Appreciate it. Wonderful to be with you all. How's everyone doing? Tasty Georgetown lunch. It's always a plus when you have events, when you know there's a bonus lunch in the mix. So Andrea has done a great job of kind of, I think, laying out the structure, and there's a handout here which will kind of go through the different chapters of the book, and on the back is some of the summary pieces from Chapter 7, which I'll kind of elaborate on. This is a very exciting moment in the field of justice and peace studies, and particularly nonviolent movements and thinking about nonviolence. We have pretty obvious things from the Arab Spring, as well as other kind of movements within the U.S. that have been percolating and trying to figure out what is possible. So this is an attempt to try to participate in the what is possible question. Here is kind of a core question for this book, and it is, why do too many U.S. residents, Catholics and Catholic leaders among them, too often fall short of adequately challenging the use of violence in U.S. policy? So, in order to kind of open this up, I'd like to ask you all a question about your experience of the notion of nonviolence. What is it that people often mean when they use nonviolence? Or perhaps what is it that you generally tend to mean when you use it? Kind of think of popular discourse. What are the trends out there with this notion? Any thoughts? Yeah.
One thought is on the difference between nonviolence and pacifism.
Okay.
And the idea being that nonviolence is the least amount of violence necessary. I think Ghaffar Khan said something that even a vegetarian kills microbes when he boils his water, but it's the least amount of violence.
Mm-hmm.
And having been around even prisons, where there was the question, how much force did you use to subdue someone? Law enforcement is always shading toward the minimal amount of force.
Uh-huh.
So the force becomes a virtue in some places. Nonviolence is a matter of bounding that force so that it's limited and that there are other options beside just sheer force.
Mm-hmm.
But that
Okay.
nonviolence is a force in itself.
Okay. So what is your name?
My name is Ken Dante.
Ken.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken. So some of the pieces there. Nonviolence as a force in itself, a very important piece. But also you seem to be describing some ways of thinking of nonviolence as this limiting kind of rule, right? It's a general rule that attempts to sort of limit the actions of violence as much as possible. So that would be an example of what I use in the book as a rule-based approach. Any other reflections from your experience? How do you see this term kind of flowing in popular discourse?
I'll go back to what the other term you mentioned was pacifism. And of course, that's a technical term in the movement, but it's often understood in public discourse as doing nothing and letting violence just happen. And so when people use the term nonviolence, they often are actually referring to that kind of pacifism, which is even a misuse of that word as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Mary, right? Mary's with us. Thank you so much. So that description, pacifism or the doing nothing or just sort of trying to avoid violence, would be an example of an absolute rule approach to nonviolence. So you have these sort of two different pieces of a rule-based approach. You have the absolute rule where one just sort of tries to avoid violence, and there are some people who generally follow that. There's a lot more people who sort of describe other people as acting like that. And then you sort of have the general rule. It is a limiting rule where we try to limit the moments of choosing violence, yet under some circumstances, some may choose that. This would be an example of just war criteria, would be kind of a more theoretical frame that looks at nonviolence as this kind of general rule. Anybody else have anything you wanted to share? Yeah, can tell us your name, please?
Hi, I'm Francisco Alvarez. I'm an undergrad student. I would say that a link has been made between pacifism and nonviolence, although I would venture to say that nonviolence is also a way to further a cause without losing legitimacy. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you stand up for you try to express a message, however novel, and because it's so new or even contentious, you further your cause by not doing something that might seem that you have some kind of conflict of interest or simply like an irresponsible actor.
Mm-hmm. Great. So a way to sort of further one's cause and to maintain legitimacy. And that word legitimacy is going to be an important, I think, piece that'll come out here. So we've talked a little bit about the absolute rule against violence. Some, for example, in the Amish community might think of themselves in this way. Or nonviolence as a general rule. So we mentioned just war criteria. Other people will use criteria such as national security to say when kind of the general rule of nonviolence needs to or should be let go of for the sake of using violence. Others will also think that we try to use nonviolence if it will work, sort of in the short term usually, or kind of if our political objectives will be accomplished by this approach. If not, if we don't think it will work, one is either willing to or more able to shift to violence if they want to use that to accomplish their political objectives. So as a parent, I think I've noticed the situations in which one might use a strategic nonviolence approach, maybe not thinking too clearly about what's best. But I think other parents might be able to resonate with that. And then we have other sort of broader examples of, South Africa, where they started with nonviolence, moved to violence, came back to nonviolence, Libya and Syria more recently, sort of generally these strategic approaches to nonviolence. So, there are these two sort of moral methods out there that I think are predominant in our society. And Catholic social teaching has, in my reading, been moving toward transcending the limits of these approaches, but it still has some significant room for growth. So in order to contribute to that growth and impact U.S. policy, I draw on Jesus, Gandhi, Ghaffar Khan, who was a Muslim peacemaker, Martin Luther King, in order to elaborate this kind of virtue-based approach with the corresponding set of core practices, which will be discussed shortly. But I also put this in conversation with human rights discourse as a sort of recognition of the steps that are needed to participate and have an impact on U.S. policy. So let me give you a little bit of just some pieces of my narrative to share with you how my social context has helped me to arise at this place. So I have, as probably many have, experienced various types of conflict in my life, out of which my passion for peacemaking arose. Sort of somewhat common things these days, from divorce to parents struggling with alcoholism, unexpected deaths of loved ones, and those sort of things which have the possibility of opening up our imagination about life. Also experiences with the poor in Haiti. I was there for 5 months after my undergrad, and that really, woke me up to questions of social justice and poverty. My first teaching opportunity at a high school was shaped by 9/11. It was the first day of class. I was in the classroom when the event happened, and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were core moments in my movement toward offering this book. So, the Catholic context. I am a practicing Catholic with a love for Jesus that has continued to orient my life since primarily my undergraduate days. And what I have found in the Catholic context that is particularly relevant here is in Vatican II, one of the key shifts was this shift to a call to holiness for all Catholics and all people, generally speaking. Before this, the call to holiness was primarily for clergy or for perhaps some in the religious orders. But this was a new challenge to folks to become the best we can be, to develop the virtues, to live as Jesus lived in full. There are also other shifts towards interreligious dialogue, towards human dignity and human rights, and returning to the value of Scripture and the role model of Jesus. But most U.S. Catholic leadership, in my opinion, has not adequately challenged U.S. political and military leadership on A, the preparation for war. We are by far the largest spender and seller of arms in the world. And B, on the use of war. Things like the atomic bomb, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Yet, documents of Catholic social teaching have been strengthening the presumption against war and recognizing the increasing importance of nonviolence for public policy. And I'll give you some examples of those documents shortly. Now, turning to sort of broader U.S. context, we have this book originally came out when Obama had been, just after he'd kind of been elected. He was working for change. We've had I think some positive things from movements on green energy and immigration and healthcare. But there continue to be some big challenges. We are still an economic power, but we continue to struggle in a lot of ways. The strain with other countries is still pretty obvious, particularly with Muslims, as we've seen in some of the recent videos and the Libya ambassador situation. One of the pieces that also contributes to this strain with other countries, I think, is our habits of militarism. We've mentioned the spending. We have military bases spread around the world. Some have counted up to 700 or so. Our recent wars, Guantanamo Bay, the use of torture, etc. Yet there is a particularly positive sign in the Department of State. There is this new bureau called the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization, and they have a program called the Civilian Response Corps, which is a group of civilian experts which are sent into conflict zones to try to prevent or diffuse conflict. And it's new, so there's a lot of room for growth, but I'll come back to this a little bit more in the paper. So we have the drone bombing, of course. We have Libya and Syria still happening. In our political rhetoric coming up to the elections, the questions on military spending are generally one person wants to sort of slow the growth of military spending, the other wants to either maintain it or increase it in some areas. And then the folks in the political running for president who talk about significant cuts in military spending are pretty much not in the debates and very much out of the mainstream. So this is just another kind of reflection, I think, of the presence of militarism in our country. So some other pieces of this context is that violence shows up often in children's toys, right? Particularly if you have a boy and you want to get a lunchbox or a Halloween costume. Almost everything you see is some form of a hero who uses violence in some particularly in a way that's considered justified. Globally, we are the most heavily armed society. We have the highest rate of civilian guns at 90 guns per 100 people. The closest country to us is Yemen at 60 guns per 100 people. The U.S. has the largest incarceration rate in the world. So these realities have arisen in a U.S. society which primarily thinks of nonviolence as a rule or a strategy. So this is kind of some of the significance as to why I'm trying to think beyond these moral approaches. So my argument is that a virtue-based assessment of nonviolent peacemaking, enhanced by aspects of human rights, will largely resolve some of these limits found in these two rule-based and strategic-based approaches. Okay, so let's move to kind of through these chapters, and I'm just going to highlight some key points, try to give you kind of a flow of the argument. So feel free to jot down whatever you want. If a question comes up, we can bring it up in the discussion phase. Okay, so a rule-based approach. I look at primarily Catholic social teaching, as well as another philosopher, James Childress, but Catholic social teaching, nonviolence is a general rule against violence, but under some conditions, violence is justified. based on just war criteria. And as I mentioned, that criteria has sort of been shrinking, particularly since Vatican II, but it still remains part of the teaching. So nonviolence is couched in this just war frame. It's determined by a defense of rights. If rights can always be defended, then one can rely on nonviolence. Otherwise, there are situations where violence is considered justified. And it was only until up until 1993, a commitment to nonviolence was considered okay for the individual, or sort of permitted. But in terms of kind of a group or a policy ethic, there was not a lot written on it. And it was, though, in 93, the U.S. bishops wrote a document, the U.S. harvest of peace, or the harvest of justice is sown in peace, where they start to raise the bar and say a nonviolent ethic should be considered now as sort of an ethic for public policy, for government use, along with this just war frame. And you can think of the context, right? After late 80s, all these nonviolent revolutions occur, so there's a lot more attention and recognition. Other examples of a rule-based approach. Politicians very recently have framed the conflict situation in Iraq, this was probably 6 years ago, as a choice between maintaining lethal force or cutting and running. So the implication is that the alternatives are violent force or passivity. So nonviolence is portrayed again as primarily a rule against the use of violence, which results in passivity or flight during conflicts. So then I lay out some of the key limits, and I'll just mention a couple here. One of the limits of a rule-based approach is that it truncates, or it kind of diminishes our imagination, particularly in terms of constructive practices of nonviolent peacemaking. It's described as being impractical for conflicts. A second key limit is there's, particularly in Catholic social teaching, a overemphasis on dialogue, and a recognition, but I would say a devaluing of nonviolent struggle when it tries to change structures of injustice. I mean, this shows up differently in different countries, so that should be recognized, but there still is some room for growth in that overall. Okay, strategy-based approaches. So here I looked at Gene Sharp and Peter Ackerman, who are two major thinkers in primarily the U.S. Gene Sharp is sometimes called the father of strategic nonviolence. He's done a lot of amazing work, and I really appreciate a lot that they have written. But their approach is primarily a strategy-based. So it's a tool sort of along with the tool of violence. But they are probably much less likely to resort to violence than perhaps some others. So what are some limits of this strategic-based approach? One of the limits is that it ends up being a shift away from personal integration and transformation, and sort of a shift towards focusing on political objectives. A second limit is that it also lacks resistance to using humiliation, particularly for the opponent or of the adversary. So it tends to ignore the strengths or the truth or the dignity at times of the opponent, which results in a de-emphasis on empathy, on healing, on reconciliation. So for example, the Serbian movement in Otpor in 99, 2000, you would see a number of signs and people saying things like, Slobo. Slobo was the leader, Milosevic. They would say, Slobo, kill yourself. Right? And this would be chanted, or there would be signs. And I think if you think of some of U.S. demonstrations, we sometimes have signs just like that about the political leaders that we don't appreciate. A third limit is that the view of the person, particularly in Sharp and Ackerman, entails an emphasis on thinking of the person as self-interested. And this is somewhat common here in U.S. culture, but it shows up again in their work on nonviolence, and that has some other repercussions. So in order to address some of these limits, I shift to Chapter 2, and I look at a virtue ethics-based approach. So for virtue ethics, kind of the primary question is, who are we becoming? Who are we becoming? It involves a who am I, who ought I to become, and how do I get there? But this is all wrapped up in who are we becoming. So there's a focus on persons more than particular actions. And a virtue is, you can think of it as this. It's a disposition or a habit that realizes a specific good of human excellence. Some examples. Let me repeat that. A disposition or a habit that realizes a specific good of human excellence. So examples would be virtue of courage, compassion, justice, prudence, etc. And there are various virtue theorists from Aristotle to Aquinas and so forth. So a good example of kind of thinking about how a virtue ethic approach works. Say you have somebody afraid of heights, right? And you're interested in trying to help them develop the virtue of courage, to sort of get over their fear of heights. So instead of kind of taking them to the top of a 10-story building and saying, experience the struggle and the trembling, and you will sort of bust into being a courageous person. A virtue ethic would say you've got to try to find kind of the adequate tension for growth. What is the adequate tension for the growth of the person or of the group or of a society? So a virtue ethic would not say, here, hang out at floor 1 and you just, think about it, and when you're ready, you kind of move up. No, it would probably take them to, say, floor 3 or 4. That kind of adequate tension. It's just like lifting weights. You want to grow your muscles, you don't start with something too easy. You start with something that's going to put some tension on your muscles. Same thing for our character. So there are core practices normally associated with different virtues that help one cultivate these virtues. And that's hence the reason for the core practices that I'm going to name towards the end of this book. All right, let's shift into some of the religious actors here. So, scriptural models of Jesus in the Christian narrative. Basically, in this initial section going through different pieces of the scripture, I describe how there's a clear commitment to nonviolent peacemaking from Jesus, and as you can sort of see within the Gospels. I elaborate some of Jesus' core practices of nonviolent peacemaking. So sort of caring for the outcasts, prioritizing those in need, loving and forgiving enemies, challenging the religious, political, economic, and military powers, healing persons and communities, praying, along with risking and offering his life on the cross to expose and transcend both injustice and violence. I give some time to the Sermon on the Mount and sort of talk about how it offers concrete practices rather than sort of otherworldly ideals. So in Matthew, you have pieces about, you've heard an eye for an eye, but I call you to turn the other cheek. You have heard, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And then the new commandment, love as I have loved you. So it's not just any kind of love. It is a nonviolent love of friends and enemies. Spend some time on Paul and some of the early Christians, and also a bit of a reflection on the Hebrew scriptures. And then I kind of move into scripture and ethics and why virtue makes sense as sort of a primary method for interpreting the ethics of scripture, the narrative form we find, the character focus, the paradigms, and then a section on theology and ethics and some of the key theological concepts and how they resonate with this virtue approach. Okay, chapter 3 is where I lay out the argument for nonviolent peacemaking itself as a distinct and central virtue for Christians. I draw particularly on Bernard Herring, who was a a key scriptural scholar during Vatican II, before Vatican II, and elaborate the virtue of nonviolent peacemaking as realizing the good of conciliatory love that draws the enemy toward friendship. So in other words, we cultivate this virtue when we engage in practices that actualize this good, that draw us towards conciliatory love, that draws enemies toward friendship. Then I move into sort of some contemporary Christian practices of nonviolent peacemaking. So we have examples we're familiar with, like Martin Luther King and nonviolent resistance, Dorothy Day, living in relationship with and caring for those in need, interreligious dialogue with Thomas Merton, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions with Desmond Tutu, Community of San Egidios, cultivating friendship and their conflict mediation, and so forth. So after laying out some practices, I spent some time with some key Christian theorists who have sort of virtue-based approaches to sort of show how I'm building off of their work. These three theorists are Bernard Herring, Stanley Hauerwas, and Lisa Cahill. Lisa Cahill's book, Love Your Enemies, was a pretty key reading for me in seeing the trajectory of some possibilities here. So again, these folks are writing out of a key shift at Vatican II. Thomas Aquinas is sort of the key virtue ethicist in Catholic tradition, but he tended to limit his call to holiness, again, to the clergy and religious. And it was Vatican II that addressed some of these limits by both expanding the call to holiness for the laity and the religious, but also reappropriating the scriptural witness and Jesus for ethics as a key piece of moral theology. So after looking at those three theorists and where they've taken us and how we're building on it, I do some reflection on the impacts that this virtue would have for other Christian virtues and some of their practices. So just quickly, for example, highlighting the virtue of nonviolent peacemaking would uplift the virtue of humility, and I sort of describe what that might entail. Hospitality, kind of the welcoming of strangers and the other. Mercy, and solidarity. But it would also qualify some key virtues that have been traditionally lifted up as primary. So I would qualify the virtue of justice and the virtue of courage particularly. For the virtue of justice, the sort of illumination that I think would occur is that we would more clearly see justice as restorative justice. So instead of the focus or a lot of space being spent on thinking of justice as retributive, who do we blame and how do we punish, there may still be some space for that, but the primary emphasis now clearly becomes restorative justice. What are the wounds to relationships by a certain act or acts, and how does one heal those wounds? And then for courage, in Aquinas, he talks about sort of courage as both enduring and attacking. He does highlight endurance as sort of the key example of courage and martyrdom. I think the virtue of nonviolent peacemaking would even illuminate that element of endurance even more, and I describe courage as the habit of suffering out of reverence, for the image of God or the dignity of others, by risking, perhaps even giving one's life, without the distortion of our dignity created by relying on lethal force or by taking another's life. And I give some core practices for both of these virtues. Okay, so moving to the end of this chapter, it leaves us with a question. To what extent can we translate various Christian arguments about virtue into other religious traditions or more public traditions of discourse and policy? These are primarily values and themes that show up clearly in Christian tradition. So chapter 4, I show by analogy how Christian practices of nonviolent peacemaking extend to and are enhanced by those beyond the Christian community, such as Gandhi as a representative of Hinduism and Ghaffar Khan as a representative of Islam. So in chapter 4, I spent some time describing Gandhi's sort of theory of nonviolence. He describes the virtue of nonviolence as the greatest virtue, but he adds an important piece to what I define as the virtue of nonviolent peacemaking. And if you flip your handout over to the back, you can see this written out for you. If you go down to chapter 7, number 1, what Gandhi adds is the second sort of specific good of human excellence. So the first part, this virtue realizes the good of conciliatory love that draws enemies toward friendship. And then Gandhi really highlights the relationship between nonviolence and truth. So this virtue, with Gandhi's influence, would also realize the good of truth, particularly the truths of our ultimate unity of all being and equal human dignity. I go in to explain why he thinks about truth and nonviolence as so embedded with each other. Some of his core practices would be things like creating ashrams, or sort of communities where people can experiment with nonviolence and learn the daily habits of the truth of everyone's dignity, and learning how to heal and to resist when injustice is happening. Fasting, caring for the Harijans, which were sort of the poor and marginalized of his community. Of course, non-cooperation and nonviolent resistance to the British occupation as well. And also constructive program, which is another key piece that he adds. He kind of has two key arms of nonviolence. So you have constructive program and obstructive program. The obstructive is sort of, if you want to use a media metaphor, kind of the more sexy stuff, right? It's the boycotts and the civil disobedience and the strikes. The constructive program is more cooperating with the good. So you try to build the society that you want to see. So it's, providing education, providing health care, parallel institutions of government, particularly caring for the poor and the marginalized is highlighted there. Okay, Gandhi also describes Jesus' practices of nonviolence as par excellence. Okay, Ghaffar Khan, again, I go into sort of his theory of nonviolence and how it relates to virtue. He lived during Gandhi's time, right in the sort of northwest frontier, which is now the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. He was amongst the Pathan tribe. So he really had an amazing impact on a community that was very much embedded in responding to dishonor with violence, that was the way they thought they upheld their dignity. And he was able to sort of translate that anger or that energy or that willingness to defend one's dignity into what was described by him as a nonviolent peace army, the first nonviolent peace army that I'm aware of in my reading. It got up to about 80,000 people. There's one sort of, prominent story where not only did they do constructive program helping women get more educated, he was a big advocate for women as a Muslim, so a key example for today. But they also offered their lives. There was a scene where the British started shooting at them. Another line would walk up and they would get shot at, and this went on and off for a couple hours. So after that incident, the army actually expanded. More people wanted to join them because they saw the sort of clearly the difference of the nonviolence and the violence, and they knew that their dignity was more in accord with the kind of courage of nonviolence. So there's a great book called The Nonviolent Soldier of Islam. I encourage you to check out, and I think it's very useful for today's conflicts as we think about how to respond and possibly heal, particularly in that area of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So what we see with Gandhi and Khan is that a virtue-based approach can function within other religious traditions and cultures, even within a religiously plural society. But can such arguments about virtue be translated into more public traditions of discourse and policy? Particularly, I focus on the United States. So Chapter 5 is an attempt to lay out some of the broader trends of moral reasoning in U.S. culture. Has anybody heard about Abdul Ghaffar Khan before? We've got 3. Great. Have you read the book, Nonviolent Soldier of Islam? Great read, great read. Somebody was trying to make a movie on it. I don't know if they ever got all the funds to make it happen, but if you're into movies, maybe it's an opportunity for you. Okay, Chapter 5. So predominant methods of moral reasoning, rule-based and sort of what I call utilitarian-based or consequences-based methods that we tend to find in U.S. public discourse, particularly dealing with issues of acute conflict. So quickly, rule-based or obligation-based tends to highlight laws, duties, rights. For example, often if people ask me what I'm teaching and I'm like, justice and peace studies, they're like, oh, you're in the law school. I'm like, well, no, I'm not in the law school. But the indication there, right, is that justice is about law, right? If you want to get at sort of responding to conflicts, unjust conflicts, then you do law. You look at the rules primarily or in a significant way to try to address that. And of course they have a role, but I'm just trying to point out kind of the predominant ways of thinking about acute conflict. The other one, consequences-based or utilitarian, this is kind of strategies or sort of preference satisfaction. So you have self-interest expanding into national interest, which drives a lot of our policy, right? So you can sort of see utilitarianism show up there. I spent a little bit of time on the notion of civil religion to help illuminate this. So civil religion is sort of a set of beliefs, symbols, or rituals in the U.S., which is unique to U.S. society and is not necessarily the same as Christianity or Judaism or any other major religions. And then as an example of kind of a key player in forming these two trends of moral reasoning and also illustrating the effects of such discourse, I do a little bit of work on explaining how these trends show up in the U.S. military. Why is the military a key institution for helping us think about these trends? It's probably somewhat obvious, but soldiers are often lifted up as our heroes or our models of virtue. Phrases like support the troops tend to trump a lot of other positions that certain people might want to take. Our society's language is often us versus them. Who do we blame? How do we punish? Things of that nature. Our financial habits clearly represent a key commitment to having a strong, developed military. U.S. spends about 45% of all global military spending. So all the money in the world spent on military structures and institutions. We spend 45% of that. So the U.S. military represents a very ordered and rule-based culture, and yet in terms of forming strategy, it often relies on utilitarian calculations. And yet it has a set of virtues that it tries to develop in the people who are participating in the military. So it offers a very interesting place for analysis. So I spent a little bit of time writing about sort of the training in the military and sort of highlight how there are these sort of rule-based elements. But also Lieutenant Grossman wrote this book called On Killing, where he kind of looked at the training developments of the military, particularly since World War II. And he highlights some of these characteristics. He says the training is more clearly geared towards dehumanizing the enemy or dehumanizing the other, desensitizing soldiers to killing, displacing responsibility for the killing. I have a relative who works in the Department of Defense, and I said, well, doesn't the training sort of dehumanize the enemy? And doesn't that raise a question about sort of if this is a humanizing sort of practice? And he says, yeah, of course, we have to dehumanize the enemy. Otherwise, they're not going to shoot him. So I don't think this is, kind of a cutting edge revelation. It seems to be part of the plan. So it's for us to kind of reflect on if this is, to take that question, who are we becoming, and see if this is the direction we think we should head. So they use language like towel heads, animals, engage the target, etc. One soldier was quoted his first experience of killing. He says, "When I killed, I did it just like that, just like I had been trained, without even thinking." One of the authors talks about how killing is often divorced from a moral context. Or Sergeant Peterson interrogated suspects in Iraq, and she was officially reprimanded for showing empathy for the prisoners. So again, who are we becoming? Is empathy something that we want to be devaluing in people, regardless of what institution they work in? She shortly afterwards, after her reprimand and getting kicked out of the army, she committed suicide in 2003. Ethan Mccord, there's a video on him finding these 2 children wounded by a U.S. helicopter. He goes and tries to seek counseling, and his superiors scold him by saying, quote, "Get the sand out of your vagina," unquote. Get the sand out of your vagina, because he wanted to seek counseling for his sort of trauma of seeing these 2 kids shot up by U.S. soldiers. And he says this is a fairly common phrase. Other soldiers have reported the same thing. So it sort of highlights the sexism, and it highlights, again, the devaluing of sort of emotional well-being, right? So who are we becoming? More statistically, impacts on soldiers. Post-traumatic stress syndrome, about 60,000 were diagnosed in 2007 of those who are willing to come and ask for help. Suicide, epidemic rates. The Army has admitted this. People are working on it. At one point, there was 120 veterans committing suicide per week in 2005. It's twice the rate of the rest of the American population, the suicide rate for vets. Drug use, violent crime, divorce rates, homelessness. About at least 25, sometimes up to 30% of the homeless people are vets, whereas they represent about 11% of the population. So, this is to say different people in the military have different responses and end up going down different roads. So these are general trends and not an attempt to sort of imply that every person struggles in these ways. But the trends are important to notice. So some of the things that come out of this is that in this, not only in this institution, but I would say as sort of an example of our culture, that virtue is not adequately being taught. And you can see that by some of the amount of ethical training in virtue that shows up in that institution, but also more broadly speaking is what this is really about. And also the kinds of people too often being created by inculcating these military virtues raise serious questions about their well-being and perhaps even more importantly, subsequent effects on our society. So in light of this kind of analysis, I turn to Martin Luther King as an example of how to address some of these limits. And King illustrates how a virtue approach to nonviolent peacemaking functions well in U.S. society, U.S. public discourse and policy. He illustrates that it should not be conceived simply as a private or merely for religious persons. His particular practices, to the extent persons participate in these practices, his 4 key ones: collecting the facts, negotiation, self-purification, very key one, direct action. But he illustrates how when people participate regularly in these, they're more likely to experience character transformation and cultivate the virtue of nonviolent peacemaking. So, drawing on his insight and and experience in the U.S., I light up sort of the Nonviolent Peace Force as an example of an institution that one could support to help develop sort of the virtue of nonviolent peacemaking. And I kind of go through some of their training and how it relates to that. I'll talk a little bit about this institution in my core practices. But anybody heard of the Nonviolent Peace Force? Okay, good. So we're getting there. This is a very prominent attempt to basically develop a peace army. And they work in Sudan, Philippines. They were in Sri Lanka previously, but we'll come back to that. Okay, so we finish up this chapter then saying, okay, so what are some initial implications for public policy with this virtue approach? So I give a bunch of examples. Let me name just two here. One is our public discourse ought to emphasize more the questions, who are we becoming, and explicitly engage our vision of human excellence. And I think when we do this, we'll more clearly see some key limits about the kinds of people in society we're becoming with our emphasis on certain notions of peace. So, for example, the Department of State tends to think about peace primarily as democratization, and so there's certain practices will tend to get highlighted, like political and civil rights, for example. The Department of Defense tends to talk about peace as sort of stability and order, usually equated with a kind of negative peace, which can at times maintain different forms of structural injustice, such as income inequity, racism, environmental degradation, and certain practices flow out of this vision of peace. So I compare these to sort of a Catholic vision of peace. It's called a convoy concept, which entails solidarity, human rights, development, forgiveness, nonviolence, and some of the practices that flow out of that vision of peace. So again, just the importance of our visions of human excellence. What does it mean to become an excellent human? And that would include how are we thinking about peace. A second example is kind of our national security strategies. So in some of the recent ones, there have been phrases like promoting human dignity. And there'd be some really good things listed under there, like defending liberty, justice, poverty. With the virtue of nonviolent peacemaking, this would add, quote, the promotion that dignity entails the promotion of nonviolent peacemaking practices as constitutive to realizing the good of human dignity. So our policy wouldn't describe military violence as some neutral instrument or tool, but instead there would be more emphasis in our policy in describing all violence as tragic and our desire to diminish it, and ultimately our hope to eliminate it as key to persons realizing the fullness of our equal dignity. Now, it doesn't just sort of stop all violence with that statement, right? But it's about laying out a vision and trying to figure out how we can move in that direction. And there may be instances of violence that occur in the meantime. A second example here in national security strategies, we often see the phrase preventing attacks against us and our friends, or preventing our enemies from threatening us, our allies and our friends. So a virtue of nonviolent peacemaking in recognizing our ultimate unity, the aim becomes to prevent attacks against all people, not merely against our friends and us. Policymakers would use alternative language such as potential partner rather than the language of enemy. Their central aim would entail reconciliation and friendship rather than isolation, defeat, or destruction of such persons. So I end this chapter with sort of acknowledging that there are limits, though, to a virtue-based approach. It has a difficulty making headway into public discourse because of sort of the rule-based and utilitarian strands of moral reasoning. And there's also a variety of virtues in U.S. residents and understanding of those virtues. So it would require sort of ongoing commitment to dialogue and kind of engaging our visions of human excellence, which also lifts up the possibility for greater humility, I think, in each of us as we realize that none of us sort of have the full truth, that we're all sort of on this journey trying to draw out the truth that we can from each person and each group. So acknowledging those limits, the next chapter, chapter 6, is an attempt to try to address some of those limits. We look at human rights discourse and how that can help supplement a virtue approach. I look at Martha Nussbaum's work on capabilities, Bill O'Neill, he's a Catholic social ethicist, Catholic social teaching more broadly. I acknowledge some of the limits of human rights because it is a rule-based approach, so I explain some of those, particularly like the compliance gap, right? There are many countries that have signed on to human rights protocols, but we consistently have problems in actually living up to those commitments, whether it be genocide or torture, etc. So what are some of the contributions that we can draw from human rights? First of all, there is more moral traction for human rights in public discourse and policy than there is for virtue at the particular moment. So recognizing that reality, I draw on, again, O'Neill and Nussbaum to talk about how rules and rights can help sort of mediate virtues. They can help illuminate how certain actions depict and call us to the virtues. Another key contribution, drawing particularly on Catholic social teaching, is that human rights can help us sort of indicate the urgency of certain claims for nonviolent peacemaking and how nonviolent peacemaking actually can protect and ensure human rights. So here are some quotes from recent popes that help to highlight the predominant emphasis on nonviolent peacemaking. Pope John Paul II argued this, quote, "Violence is evil. Violence is a lie, for it goes against the truth of our faith, the truth of our humanity. Violence destroys what it claims to defend, the dignity, the life, and the freedom of human beings. Violence is a crime against humanity." And now he's talking particularly to young adults here, and he says, "Do not follow leaders who train you in the way of inflicting death. Give yourself to the service of life, not the work of death. Do not think that courage and strength are proved by killing and destruction. True courage lies in working for peace. Violence is the enemy of justice, and only peace can lead the way to true justice." This is pretty provocative stuff from Pope John Paul, which doesn't always get highlighted, and certainly I think has some implications for where the teaching might be headed. Pope Benedict, the Pope today, has said violence degrades the dignity of both the victims and the perpetrators. So again, who are we becoming? How do we uphold human dignity? These are some of their reflections. The last piece about human rights is Catholic social teaching and the UN Declaration of Human Rights highlights both socioeconomic rights along with political civil rights as equally valid and important to uphold. So socioeconomic rights would be like the rights to adequate food, education, health care, the right to unionize. So in our country, we tend to do a pretty good job on political civil rights. We haven't officially recognized socioeconomic rights, although many folks try to move in that direction. But drawing on this tradition of rights, I think, would help to lift that up and increase our commitment to those. All right, let's turn to the end, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the fruits. Are there any fruits to all this lingo and thinking? Here's what I'm suggesting. What is the impact on Catholic social teaching and U.S. policy? So, 1993, the U.S. bishops wrote this document, Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace. This was the 10-year anniversary of Challenge of Peace, which focused a lot on nuclear weapons and sort of the individual commitment to nonviolence. So here's what they say in their 93 document. Although nonviolence has often been regarded as simply a personal option or vocation, recent history suggests that in some circumstances it can be an effective public undertaking as well. One must ask whether it also should have a place in the public order with the tradition of justified and limited war. Nonviolent strategies need greater attention in international affairs. And at the same time, they also have a lot of, they say, increasing questions about just war theory, about whether we are the kind of culture that could actually use it correctly. And they say that's because we tend to lack a spirit of moderation. We have an increasing disrespect for the sacredness or the right to life. So they're just raising questions about the usefulness of just war theory today. Okay, so the core practices. So if you look at your handout, number 1 is the definition that I would lift up for Catholic social teaching and more broadly. And there are 7 core practices which help cultivate this virtue. So for me, this is kind of the exciting stuff here as we look at what can we do to try to cultivate, create this kind of virtue in ourselves and our society. So the first one is generally kind of meditation and prayer, particularly with an orientation to nonviolence. But in Catholic circles, there's an invitation to celebrate the Eucharist with an explicit orientation to nonviolent peacemaking, because this is sort of a key element in formation of Catholics. And other communions also have this practice. And there's a priest who has written a suggestion for an alternative Eucharistic prayer that could be used as an option for priests within celebrations of Mass. So some of the language is just, he says, on the night before he went forth to his eternally memorable and living, life-giving death, rejecting violence, loving his enemies, praying for his persecutors, he bestowed upon his disciples the gift of a new commandment: love one another as I have loved you, so you also should love one another. It kind of goes on. So it's just kind of more explicit language on Jesus's teaching about loving our enemies and committing to nonviolence as part of the Eucharistic prayer. Fasting would also be another element here. The second core practice would be education and training. So here is where the moral imagination becomes really important, right? Whether it be justice and peace studies courses, or if you're teaching high school and you're working at the social justice level, but helping each other develop our moral imagination. John Paul Lederach is drawn on here in this section. This is where there'd be training on sort of nonviolent resistance strategies, so that we become the kind of people who can do the Egypts or the Tunisias of today and do them well. Also in this section, I talk a little bit about sort of developing analogous programs to like ROTC and JROTC programs. So could we develop sort of peace leadership training programs at both the high school and college levels, at least along with these ROTC programs, if not potentially as alternatives at some point. So these would help train people so that they could become leaders in peacemaking down the road, whether it's working with the Peace Corps or working on a nonviolent revolution or working with the Nonviolent Peace Force or Christian peacemaker teams, etc. The Department of State, again, has a civilian response corps, but they have little expertise in nonviolent resistance at this point. Okay, third practice, religion, attention to religious and spiritual factors, especially for public discourse and interreligious dialogue. Great book called The Missing Dimension of Statecraft, Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft. Iraq War would be a good example. We didn't quite get sort of the religious trends and the implications of the religious conflicts there that would arise out of our activity there. We talked a lot about political reconciliation, but not enough about social reconciliation. I think having religious attaches to different diplomatic missions and different embassies would be a big plus in helping us develop this virtue. The fourth practice, constructive program, building the alternative, attention to the poor and the marginalized. So here we talk about fair trade, the importance of human security, at least along with national security. The fifth practice is conflict transformation and restorative justice. So Catholic social teaching, John Paul II again says, no peace without justice, but no justice without forgiveness. So opening the conceptual space again towards restorative justice. Conflict transformation is too often off the radar of policymakers, as they tend to think primarily about conflict resolution. And I talk a lot about truth and reconciliation commissions, like potentially for Iraq, Afghanistan. And again, Civilian Response Corps does not have experts in restorative justice, and I suggest that as a positive direction. There was one Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the U.S. Anybody know? Japanese term it. I don't know if that was called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think there were kind of small-scale efforts. Greensboro, North Carolina, 2005, I believe, but for a case from 1979. KKK had this march. Police seemed to disappear. A lot of black leaders got killed. So the civil society just had their own Truth and Reconciliation Commission because the state government didn't want to deal with it. They weren't getting any federal help. You can find the report online. So encouragement to increase this practice. Okay, the last two. Unarmed civilian peacekeeping. This is sort of nonpartisan peacekeeping, groups like Nonviolent Peace Force, Peace Brigades International, Christian peacemaker teams. There's a Muslim peacemaker teams that were developed in Iraq. They do things like accompanying human rights actors in risky situations to diffuse the chances they'll be attacked. They engage with armed actors. They do monitoring. Occasionally they'll do interposition, putting their bodies in the way of potential flare-ups. A lot of great development here. Again, Civilian Response Corps could use experts in this area, and it's starting to change the debate on U.S. peacekeeping and what that could possibly look like down the road. All right, last one, civilian-based defense, nonviolent resistance and non-cooperation to defend against military invasion, occupation, or internal coups. There are a few examples of this that we know of in recent history. It is something which is sort of, again, very much in the experimental phase. It obviously would have fuller participation of society. Czechoslovakia in 1968 against the Russians is an example that you can kind of read about. Russia used this in 91 to sort of prevent an internal coup. The countries, Sweden, Austria, and Lithuania, have been officially doing research on this as part of their defense planning. So there are possibilities out there. It would take certain stages to build up to, but I think it's a key practice for us to lift up as we think about how to cultivate this virtue. So let me end there. The last chapter is applying these practices to the case in Sudan, a kind of a genocide situation, and one of the more challenging cases, and what can these practices sort of light up for that situation. So thank you for your patience. I look forward to your insights, and I love to sort of keep learning about this and hopefully working together to become as excellent as we can.
Thank you, Eli. Let's turn it over immediately to any audience members who have questions, because I know I have some questions for you, but I will give it over first to anybody here who has questions.
Yeah, I have a quick question. If you know of, if there are other countries where there's maybe a better model for this, if there are other countries where the Catholic leadership and Catholic population is more actively engaged in moral foreign policy advocacy.
Are there other countries where Catholic leadership is more engaged in the foreign policy advocacy?
Yeah. I think it maybe is a model. Maybe foreign policy is exactly right. Kind of as a model for what you're hoping.
Yeah, well, definitely in terms broadly of peace building, I would say. Countries like the Philippines, I think, have had a lot of positive development. Where else? Maybe New Zealand is definitely a country which has grown a lot in the restorative justice scene. I'm not sure on where sort of Catholic leadership has been on that, but I think that might be a possibility. I think Sudan, there's been a lot of contributions there to the peace building work. Yeah, those would be there's probably some others.
Thank you so much for this great talk. My question is, how do you see Catholic social thought, broadly speaking, on this issue? Because in some ways it seems like we went from Jesus to Vatican II. And you quoted Pope John Paul II and Benedict. What is going on in the meantime that brought us to Vatican II? How did that develop? Do you look at finding minorities in the Catholic tradition that you want to bring out and highlight, or do you see this as sort of a reinterpretation of the Catholic tradition? I'm just curious how you view where we are today in the long 2,000 years of Catholic history.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Thank you. Well, how did we get from Jesus to Vatican II? I mean, that is a large historical question. I don't do a lot of sort of the history. I point to some of the theological themes which are relevant for sort of virtue ethics, and those have been developed through the tradition over these 2,000 years. I mean, some of the main moments were, Augustine writing in 300 or so and starting to think about possibilities of just war as the Romans were being attacked by barbarians, and then Constantine becomes the head of the Roman Empire and kind of makes Catholicism the official religion. So that's where you start to get some shifts away from kind of nonviolent peacemaking, broadly speaking, to these possible just war situations. You have all sorts of schisms that occur in the church sort of in the next 1,000 years or so, right? And some have related that to sort of how our teaching got to where it is today. Then you have Aquinas also sort of developing some of the just war criteria. But he does it in a section where he says, when is war not a sin? So the implication is pretty strong with Aquinas that war is generally a sin, and all soldiers were required to do like this repenting kind of ritual when they came back. And certainly the clergy were not supposed to participate in this because they were to model Jesus. They were called to holiness. So that's why the shift at Vatican II is so important, because they say, no, it's not just the clergy, it's all of us. So let's play out what that might mean for us today. How do we deal with that? And then you have sort of international law take on some of the just war criteria after Aquinas and kind of through that. St. Francis was a key actor. Yeah, he went and hung out with some of the Muslims during the Crusades, trying to do some peacemaking and caring for the poor and stuff. So, there's all these different traditions, and there's teaching, but there's practices too. So, working with some of the practices which have developed from Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day and San Egidio, and that interacts with teaching, throughout time. So I think the interaction now has gotten us to the place where, ever since Vatican II, there's been increasing questions about just war theory. Can it actually function in modern war with the kinds of weapons we have, which seem to not be able to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, right? More and more civilians are being killed in war. The rates are going up, even though we continue to try to say our technology is getting better and we're able to be smart. So there's more questions in Catholic social teaching. There's more appreciation for sort of nonviolent struggle on a large scale. So I'm just trying to be part of that conversation there. Yeah.
Thanks, Eli. I guess I got a big question, but so I'm with you on a lot of this, the limits of the rule-based and strategic approaches, the need for a conception of nonviolent virtue, some sort of structure of skill in the soul or whatever. But it seems to me something's left out here, right? Now,
Sure.
Because, I mean, most of your examples were of active violence, responding to active direct violence, but I'm sure you agree that structural violence, in fact, causes a great deal more harm.
Uh-huh.
Many more people die from the day-to-day operation of the economic system than from all the wars in the world and things of that sort.
Right.
And one of the most important sort of sociological observations about structural injustice of various forms is that it can exist without anyone actively pursuing it, or indeed tacitly pursuing it, right? I mean, nobody wants to destroy the environment, consciously or unconsciously. No one, or not many people, I suppose, want there to be poor, miserable, starving people in the world. These things emerge out of our structures of interaction. But if structural violence is consistent with a lack of individual violence, it seems to me that it just follows that structural nonviolence, the building of the kind of systems that lead to flourishing lives, can't be fully a matter of individual virtue. We have to look as well at something like nonviolence that exists within the sociological structures or things like that, right? I mean, and to put it, not to put too fine a point on it, but if you have a bunch of the most wonderfully nonviolent, virtuous humans in the world operating within a corporatist economic system, it's still going to be a damn violent world, right? So I'm just wondering if that, if you see that as a sort of, as a separate dimension from the three forms of nonviolence you've talked about, and how you see it relating. I mean, it strikes me that these virtues you're talking about may be necessary conditions to tackling that, but they just, they can't in themselves be sufficient.
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely highlighting a key justice and peace studies theme: direct violence, structural violence, cultural violence, as sort of part of this web that you have to address together. First of all, individual virtue, I would say, yes, this is an invitation for individuals or persons to develop this virtue, but they can never do it alone. It's always in this relationship with others, such that we can ask the question, who are we becoming, for a group, for Georgetown University, for Catholics, for U.S. residents. So I think the invitation is a question for societies or the structures that we have. In terms of the practices, two of them I think would help address them. Particularly Constructive program is about getting at the unjust structures. So fair trade is talked about. The Millennium Development Goals is talked about. The sort of human security in comparison to national security and what that lights up. Caring for the poor and the marginalized is kind of a key element there. And then also the education piece, I think, is another piece where you can start lifting up the way structural violence is related to direct violence and cultural violence as well. So, I mean, those would be the ways that I think it might show up in this book. I would agree with you that there is more analysis that could complement some of this stuff in terms of really getting at how the structures form our imagination or impact our notion of virtue. Or I'm in agreement with you there as a key part. But those are where it shows up here, and there's certainly room for further elaboration on it. Anybody else?
Thank you very much, Eli. My question relates to what you talked about today and in the book about 1993 being this year when the Catholic bishops finally talked about nonviolence as an ethic, and that there was a change of discourse among some of the leadership, he said, of the Catholic Church with the bishops. And so I thought about other leadership in the Catholic Church, specifically the women, those pesky Catholic nuns who we all know and love. And I was just reading an article today about I can't remember her name, but a sister of the Holy Child. She's 82 years old, and she's been holding a nonviolent demonstration at a nuclear power plant in the United States for weeks and months. Yeah. So I'm just wondering if you had any comment on kind of the alternative leadership of the Catholic Church, the women, and kind of their role in Catholic social teaching and nonviolence.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. So the role of women leadership, and particularly the nuns, it sounds like you're interested in. Well, I think the first thing that I would notice is that when we take the question, who are we becoming, and we start to seriously wonder about the virtues and how we can cultivate virtues, it is not just sort of an exercise of the mind in theory, right? One develops the virtues as far as they participate in certain core practices or practices that can cultivate those virtues. Hence, I lay out at least 7 here. And for the nuns, I think what they do really well and what they really illuminate for our church is how to live in the midst of those practices, whether it be they're caring for the poor or the immigrants or all the hospitals they run, all the schools they run. One of their gifts is to illuminate for others how to practice and to invite us into that challenge of our practices. What do we prioritize in our lives? What do we spend our time on? And it helps Catholicism particularly because, as you know, our leadership in terms of kind of official leadership is male. So there is a lot of them do great things, but one of the temptations is to allow sort of theory and analytical thinking have too much space in the way one leads. And I think the nuns try to help them and us mitigate that temptation and sort of, see Jesus in the poor as Mother Teresa and others have helped us do through the years. So.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, first off. Just to, I guess, kind of raise the image of sacrificial nonviolence, in a sense being a sacrament. I think of it even from some of the Sufi teachings, as well as Christian teachings, as being a sacrificial path where something has to be put on the line or something has to be gambled for some greater cause or some greater purpose, and how that might even relate to kind of an inner integrity, that if one were not to take a certain step, one might lose one's sense of inner integrity. And I'm just to, if you would comment on the sacrificial nature of it. Oh, and another thought, this is more from the Sufi path. There was the sense of knighthood, which I think Gandhi kind of captures some of that spirit in the Satyagraha, the spiritual knight. But also in his path, there's the sense of non-attachment.
Right.
So that one doesn't do something for a particular purpose to get something, but one does it as a way of being because this is what one is. Mm-hmm. And the result is up to the divinity of the universe, etc. So, a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Can you just clarify the sacrificial nature of nonviolence or Christianity?
Well, I think initially in many beginnings of movements, there's a great power disparity. Whether it's a new religion or a nationalistic movement or kind of a spiritualized nationalistic movement in the case of Gandhi and some others. Right. And in that great power imbalance, one may have to be willing to sacrifice oneself, one's profession, one's livelihood, one's physical well-being, one's status in the culture, go to jail. And that wears very thin after a couple of years. I mean, you lose the sense of romanticism that can accompany nonviolence. And in some ways, you might even say that the pure nonviolence is even stripped of romanticism. Mm-hmm. That's quite a statement. But,
yeah. Yeah, thank you. Well, sacrifice, I think if you take the etymology of the word, to make sacred, right? So I think the insight that we can draw from that is that the movement of offering oneself, or I would use the word being a gift in the world, amongst other gifts, is consistent with our dignity, with who we are. You use the word integrity. So, when it comes to like nonviolent resistance and sort of these calls for sacrificing time or power or well-being or even one's life, those have to be strategic decisions. They can't just be sort of to do it for the sake of sacrifice. And when I say strategic, I don't mean simply like political objective, but you do it because not simply because you want to become sort of famous or well-known or sort of revered as holy, but because you're participating in an invitation for all people to live in accord with their dignity, to be willing to offer their time, resources, life. And this, people who join the military have the notion of sacrifice, right? And there's many of them who recognize that value and want to participate in it somehow. So I think it's an important frame, but I would want to keep the recognition on how it is consistent with human dignity and that we're all being drawn into that. So it's not just sort of one person trying to sort of make a name for themselves in history, Does that help?
I'm not sure. I also think there's the sense that in the moment that happens, one might answer the call in the moment and not even premeditate.
Sure.
Let's use the case of someone who's being violently attacked, and you decide to throw yourself in between that attack.
Right.
So they don't get harmed. You may not have woken up that morning with an expectation. Joseph Campbell used this example of this policeman in, I believe it was Hawaii, and this person jumps off this cliff for attempting suicide, and this cop grabbed for them. He was lucky the cop behind him grabbed him. But in that moment, he would have lost his life, and they asked him afterwards, why did you do that? You could have lost your life.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I don't think I could have lived with myself had I not. It's just
Yeah.
like one of those moments that he didn't wake up that morning.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to training ourselves, right? The importance of creating an imagination and a set of habits where one is more likely in a situation like that to respond in the way that is healthy for everybody. That is, in some cases, an offering. So that goes for nonviolent actors, or police obviously get trained to some extent in this way of thinking. Gandhi's non-attachment stuff is, I think, just another indicator of why he wasn't sort of strategic based, right? He wasn't kind of focused on kind of immediate fruits or political objectives per se, but it was about kind of opening oneself to the direction of the universe for him and kind of participating in having integrity, right? And trying to be that illuminating the truth, that everybody has a piece of the truth, and if we use violence, we destroy part of that. So yeah, very important pieces.
Thank you, Eli. I don't have a question articulated, but one interest of mine is with something in regards to what you mentioned with the tension that's needed for character growth and to just work on this active nonviolence. And in that process, I think, to become nonviolent, for me, it almost is like violent, the process itself. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit maybe about that interior process as an individual and then also as society.
Okay, Reagan, could you, hold on, could I ask her a question? Can you explain a little more, why does it feel like it becomes violent to go through the process of creating the tension? Is that what you're describing?
To try and become non-violent, especially after facing some kind of conflict or something, to not respond or react with violence. Interiorly, it is a struggle. And so violence may be the wrong term, but there's something that's going on that I think is very important, and oftentimes people hesitate to go through that, I think, because it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, certainly you put a finger on there, the challenge of growing as people, right? Growing in character, changing perhaps in significant ways. I mean, for me, that is the reason why, like, community is so important. Being in a supportive, or particularly a community that's trying to experiment with nonviolent peacemaking, you know, whether it's a group of friends or the Catholic Worker House, or Gandhi had these ashrams, you know, or might be the Jesuit community here, right? Various groups that can help us in that deep struggle, because it can be very scary, and almost people don't want to go there because there's all sorts of psychological baggage that we deal with that has built up in us, you know, from being ignored to being pushed to seeing violence either in the home or on TV, and that takes a lot of massaging and care and gentleness, and that's why it cannot be, you know, done alone. And I think it also invites us to be patient with each other, right? And not to condemn those who seem to be maybe going slower than we might want them to, perhaps.
Can I just jump in on this? I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's really important not to think that pain or conflict or something like that is necessarily violent, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's only violent if it's contributing to a diminution of health overall, right? I mean, any nonviolent relationship is going to involve confrontation at times, and
Right.
growth is going to involve pain and struggle and difficult. I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of
Yeah,
the.
yeah.
You asked. You started with the public perceptions, and I think
Right.
nonviolence is being nice all the time is probably the primary lie about what this is about.
Yeah.
And
So.
must steadfastly resist
Right.
that.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So conflict is an opportunity for growth. This is the conflict transformation
Essential sometimes.
kind of frame, right? Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to end our formal event there. Thank you very much, Eli, for these last 90 minutes or so, and enlightening us, enriching us, making us question ourselves, our leaders, whether in the church or in the government, and best wishes on your work. And thank you very much, everybody. I'm sure that Eli would welcome further dialogue and questions, and of course, anybody who wants to purchase a book. And thank you again very much to the Berkley Center for hosting this event today.